There are moments in history where silence feels like a shadow, stretching across centuries, hiding truths that were too uncomfortable to speak aloud. The story of untouchability, its rise, endurance, and eventual collapse is one of those shadows that once crept quietly across ancient societies. Though we often associate it with the Indian subcontinent, its ripples, its ideas, and its rigid social philosophies reached into surrounding regions, influencing cultural understandings in parts of ancient China. There, hierarchical purity, ritual status, and social segregation were shaped by deeply rooted concepts of pollution and cleanliness, shaping the lives of countless ordinary people. Imagine a world where a child's entire future, where they could live, whom they could speak to, what work they could do, and how others could even look at them, was determined not by choice, not by talent, but by the accident of birth. A world where exclusion was woven into daily life so seamlessly that generations accepted it as the natural order. A world where whispers of impurity could shatter a life before it ever began. This story starts long before laws, kings, and empires rose and fell. It begins in the dim centuries of antiquity, when rigid systems of ritual hierarchy slowly emerged and hardened, creating a structure that justified social distance, religious separation, and economic inequality through an invisible but powerful ideology that came to be known as untouchability. Untouchability, though formally recognized and widely studied in the context of the Indian caste system, grew out of a broad ancient worldview that categorized humans into spiritual and ritual classes. Ideas of purity and pollution became essential to understanding the social order. These early philosophies, rooted in ritualistic traditions, agrarian communities, and priest-led societies, eventually developed into systems that separated people according to their occupation and inherited status. Those who handled animal carcasses, worked with leather, or dealt with sanitation and other tasks considered ritually impure were set apart. Over time, these distinctions became rigid, forming the earliest seeds of untouchability, which were later codified in religious texts, community norms, and legal structures. Meanwhile, ancient China, though not practicing untouchability in the exact sense known in India, developed a parallel system of social stratification. Through deeply established Confucian ideals, low and mean people, such as slaves, bondservants, entertainers, and certain occupational groups, were considered unclean or morally inferior. This created a form of exclusion that mirrored the same cultural logic, maintaining order by dividing people into fixed roles. This connection is important because it shows how the idea of inherited impurity and restricted mobility was not isolated. It was part of a broader ancient pattern, one born from fear, ritual practices, and attempts to impose order on expanding civilizations that struggled to manage diversity and complexity. As centuries unfolded, untouchability transformed from simple ritual caution into a deeply enforced social institution. It controlled where someone could walk, what water they could drink, how they could dress, and which spaces they could enter. These rules were not enforced by armies or kings alone, but by society itself. Families, neighbors, village councils, priests, and local officials all played a part, forming a self-sustaining cycle where every generation inherited the prejudices of the previous one. Those who benefited from these systems were the higher classes who possessed land, authority, and religious power. By branding certain groups as polluted, they preserved exclusive access to the most respected roles, such as teaching, administration, priesthood, and governance. Even in ancient China, where Confucianism emphasized harmony, social hierarchy was maintained through strict obedience, ritual propriety, and the classification of good versus base occupations. This resulted in entire groups actors, butchers, tanners, executioners, and slaves being excluded from full social status and treated as inherently inferior. Although this wasn't identical to the South Asian Dalit experience, it followed the same logic of building order by restricting certain people to the bottom of society. It ensured that communities absorbed inequality as an unquestioned truth passed down through generations. Thus, untouchability in its broad, comparative sense thrived not because it was just or rational, but because those at the top needed its existence to preserve their power, purity, and privilege. For those placed at the lowest end of the hierarchy, whether Dalits in the Indian subcontinent or the socially marginalized Jianmin and Min people in ancient Chinese society, the lived reality was defined by constant humiliation, economic hardship, and psychological confinement. They were forced to do labor that others refused, restricted to certain settlements or quarters of towns, denied access to schools and temples, and excluded from festivals and public rituals. They were taught from birth that they should not expect fairness, dignity, or upward mobility. It was a world where a child could witness their parents being avoided, their shadow considered defiling, their very presence deemed unworthy. This left deep scars that shaped entire communities. Yet despite this exclusion, these groups developed incredible resilience. They found strength in close-knit families, rich cultural traditions, oral histories, and unique craftsmanship. They survived through inner strength rather than societal acceptance. In many regions, including those influenced by China's rigid social hierarchy, the marginalized preserved stories of courage and community, even as official structures ignored or oppressed them. As centuries turned and empires rose like towering waves before collapsing into forgotten dust, the institution of untouchability didn't weaken. Instead, it grew sharper, more deeply stitched into the fabric of everyday life. The division between the pure and the impure became so normal that people no longer questioned it. If our last journey revealed how the seeds of exclusion were planted, today we expose how those seeds took root, spread, and shaped entire civilizations. As kingdoms expanded, populations grew, and trade routes flourished, societies sought stronger ways to maintain order. They feared that diversity and interaction could disrupt the carefully arranged social structure. And so, the rules surrounding untouchability became more elaborate, more ritualized, and more socially enforced. Entire books, customs, and oral traditions emerged to justify why certain individuals must live at the edge of the village or at the bottom of the hierarchy. Even emperors, scholars, and philosophers, those we think of as wise and moral, rarely challenged these norms. They allowed exclusion to seep into the legal systems of states, the spiritual codes of temples, and the unwritten rules that dictated daily behavior. In Chinese domains influenced by Confucian thought, a parallel idea took hold. Defining people by their occupation and birth became even more entrenched, forming strict social orders that mirrored the logic of untouchability, even if expressed differently. All of this unfolded quietly, behind the scenes of grand historical events, reminding us that the most powerful systems are often the ones that operate not with force, but with silence, shaping societies from within. To understand how these systems of exclusion persisted for so long, we have to look at the rulers under whose watch they solidified. Leaders didn't always create these structures, but they allowed them to remain untouched, turning them into unspoken political tools. In the Indian subcontinent, ancient kingdoms and early dynasties gradually absorbed caste-based hierarchies into their administrative frameworks. They used this social order to maintain stability over diverse populations. Rulers changed from early Vedic tribes to regional monarchies, to classical kingdoms, to medieval empires, but the caste hierarchy, along with the exclusion of groups later known as Dalits, remained woven into society. It was largely unquestioned, often justified by religious advisors who saw purity and impurity as essential for maintaining divine balance. Similarly, in China, the rulers of various dynasties like the Qin, Han, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing all maintained a social structure where the good people, the Liangmin, held respected roles, while the mean people, the Jianmin, were confined to generationally inherited occupations deemed inferior. Even though Chinese philosophy emphasized harmony, the idea that certain people were destined to serve in low-status roles persisted across reigns. Some dynasties even codified these groups into law, forbidding them from intermarrying with higher classes or changing their occupation. This created a system that mirrored the rigidity seen in untouchability-based societies. So while kings, emperors, and courts changed countless times, the structures of exclusion survived every political shift. It shows that discriminatory systems often persist not because a single ruler enforces them, but because each new ruler fails to dismantle them. As time passed, exclusion became so normal that it blended into religion, culture, and law. It created a cycle where each institution reinforced the other, making untouchability appear not only socially acceptable, but morally correct in the eyes of many historical communities. Religious authorities interpreted ancient ideas of purity in ways that deepened social divides. Cultural traditions mirrored these beliefs through marriage rules and ceremonial practices. Legal codes justified them by associating social order with political stability. And society itself followed these patterns through daily habits, from segregated living spaces to restrictions on water access, food sharing, clothing, and rituals. The abstract idea of impurity became a lived reality, experienced every hour of every day. In the Chinese context, Confucian teachings that prioritized hierarchy, obedience, and duty were interpreted to support a deeply stratified society. Certain occupations were considered dirty, shameful, or unworthy, creating long-lasting social barriers that aligned with the same structure of inherited inferiority. This proves that inequality can flourish even in philosophical systems that speak of harmony and moral balance. These layers of reinforcement made the system so durable that even well-intentioned reformers found it difficult to challenge centuries of conditioning. Discrimination was no longer merely a rule, it had become a worldview, a belief system, an unquestioned truth woven into festivals, stories, family traditions, and spiritual teachings. This gave the system extraordinary endurance across generations and geographical boundaries. For those living under the weight of untouchability and similar systems, daily life was a quiet struggle. It unfolded behind the walls of powerful empires and celebrated dynasties, where magnificent palaces and flourishing trade masked the pain of entire communities. These people had no real freedom of movement, no access to learning, no hope of respected occupations, and no sense that society would ever recognize their dignity. Their lives were shaped by silent endurance, not by opportunity. Children born into these communities grew up watching their parents work tirelessly while remaining socially invisible. Their homes were often on the outskirts, their rituals separated, their talents ignored, their voices unheard. Their dreams were shaped not by possibility, but by limitation. In ancient China, the Jianmin and other marginalized groups experienced a similar emotional isolation. They were bound by roles they did not choose, their social identity inherited like an unbreakable chain. And though their conditions differed in cultural details from the Dalits of the Indian subcontinent, the emotional reality was parallel, a shared sense of being born into a world that had already decided their worth. Yet, even in these shadows, resilience thrived. Communities found strength within themselves through shared stories, music, craftsmanship, and spiritual practices. They held on to a belief, sometimes faint, sometimes fierce, that one day the boundaries surrounding them would weaken. This inner hope would eventually become the spark that inspired future movements for change, long before those movements had names, leaders, or legal recognition. It just goes to show that even the most deeply rooted systems can only survive until the human spirit begins to question the silence. There comes a moment in every long-standing system when the first cracks begin to appear. It doesn't happen with loud upheavals, but with subtle questions whispered in quiet corners. In the long story of untouchability and similar exclusionary systems, like those in regions influenced by ancient Chinese hierarchies, these first cracks emerged slowly, almost invisibly. Individuals began to sense that the inherited rules governing purity, occupation, and social value weren't divine or unchangeable. They were simply human constructs, sustained by tradition and fear. This period marks a turning point. Centuries of silence started to loosen. A few brave thinkers, spiritual teachers, wandering scholars, poets, and reform-minded visionaries dared to ask why asterisk? Why were certain people deemed permanently inferior? Why should a person's destiny be dictated by their birth? Why did society accept a ladder where some could climb freely while others were trapped on the lowest rung forever? These early voices were small and scattered, but they carried an energy that quietly unsettled the foundations of these oppressive structures. They prompted gradual shifts in spiritual interpretation, challenged rigid ritual purity codes, and planted the earliest seeds of a social awakening. In China, Confucian scholars, Buddhists, and Taoist thinkers occasionally questioned the moral fairness of inherited inferiority. In the Indian subcontinent, saints, poets, and reformers emerged from different regions, speaking of equality, spiritual unity, and human dignity. Their words didn't immediately dismantle the system, but they pierced the centuries-old darkness, like distant lanterns glowing through a thick fog, hinting that change, although still far away, was beginning to stir beneath the surface of seemingly unbreakable norms. Across different eras and landscapes, these reformers emerged not as warriors, but as storytellers, philosophers, spiritual guides, and social observers. They used words instead of weapons to challenge the boundaries of exclusion. Their influence grew slowly, echoing from villages to cities, from temples to royal courts, from local gatherings to scholarly circles. In the Indian subcontinent, saints from various traditions, Bhakti, Sufi, and other regional spiritual movements began to preach messages that directly contradicted caste-based discrimination. They insisted that divinity resided in every single soul, regardless of birth. Their songs, poems, and teachings traveled from one community to another, sometimes carried by wandering singers, sometimes whispered from teacher to student. This formed a kind of spiritual resistance that questioned the very logic of impurity. Meanwhile, in China, philosophical and moral debates occasionally surfaced within Confucian and Buddhist circles. They questioned the treatment of the Jianmin, the so-called mean people, and other low-status groups. Although Chinese society remained structured by hierarchy, these discussions created a gentle pressure on rigid divisions. They encouraged notions of compassion, moral worth, and the value of a person's character over their inherited status. As these reform-minded individuals continued their work, they transformed people's inner landscapes. They slowly convinced them that inequality was not nature's command, but society's invention. This shift, subtle yet profound, became the heartbeat of future change. It revealed that revolutions of thought often begin not with shouted slogans, but with the quiet realization that the world does not have to remain as it is. As these reformist ideas spread, society itself began to experience a gradual transformation. Small communities started embracing new interpretations of spirituality, equality, and social value. Although these changes weren't universal or immediate, they marked the beginning of a slow yet irreversible shift in collective consciousness. In some regions of the Indian subcontinent, local rulers and community leaders introduced initial measures to reduce the harshness of untouchability. At the same time, rising urbanization and economic shifts created new environments where people of different backgrounds met, traded, and interacted in ways that challenged the old boundaries, making it harder to enforce strict separation. In China, particularly during later dynasties, occasional attempts were made to loosen the rigidity of the Jianmin status. Some emperors allowed for limited social mobility or granted freedom to certain groups. This reflected a growing recognition that inherited inferiority was socially harmful and economically limiting. Cultural developments like literature, theater, and philosophical discussions increasingly portrayed human dignity with more nuance. This allowed audiences to empathize with characters from lower social groups, slowly eroding centuries of prejudice. New occupations emerged, economic systems evolved, and the rise of trade networks connected people across vast distances. These interactions made rigid hierarchies harder and harder to maintain. Although the old system struggled to hold its shape, it persisted stubbornly. This revealed that even as society began to shift, the structures of exclusion clung to survival, resisting change. They held on until legal reforms, political movements, and a widespread social awakening finally created a turning point that no ancient ideology could withstand forever. In the period just before large-scale reforms truly began, the marginalized communities, whether Dalits facing untouchability in the Indian subcontinent or low-status groups in Chinese society, found themselves in a world suspended between the past and the future. The heavy weight of discrimination still shaped their daily lives, yet faint but unmistakable signs of change glimmered on the horizon. This gave rise to a fragile hope that simply had not existed in earlier centuries. Children still grew up in segregated spaces, performing the same occupations their ancestors had been forced into. Many families continued to endure limited access to education, restricted movement, and reduced opportunity. But for the first time, they also heard stories of reformers. They saw communities beginning to question old beliefs, and they witnessed the emergence of leaders and voices advocating for dignity and equality. This created a strange emotional landscape, half shadow, half sunrise. People lived with the same old hardships, yet sensed that something in the world was shifting, even if they didn't fully understand what it was. In China, the boundaries separating the Jianmin and the common people had begun to weaken, though slowly. Individuals from marginalized groups occasionally glimpsed the possibility of social movement or changing their identity. In the Indian subcontinent, whispers of reform had begun to echo more widely, laying the foundation for future movements that would challenge untouchability, not only spiritually, but socially, politically, and legally. In this moment right before transformation, the pain of centuries coexisted with a newfound courage. This courage fueled a quiet determination, setting the stage for the next chapter one in which change would no longer be a distant echo, but a force strong enough to reshape history itself. Centuries of inherited silence were about to be shattered. The system of untouchability and parallel social hierarchies in regions influenced by ancient Chinese traditions had finally reached a breaking point. Old beliefs could no longer contain the rising force of human consciousness. This moment was filled with an electricity that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether humanity would rise above its ancient shadows or fall back into their comfort. Increased communication, new political movements, global philosophical ideas, and the unmistakable power of education began to sweep across societies like unexpected winds. These winds carried seeds of equality into places where discrimination had once seemed eternal. The people who had lived for generations on the edges suddenly found their voices aligning with the voices of reformers, scholars, leaders, and ordinary citizens whose eyes had finally opened to a simple truth. Inequality, no matter how old, is still inequality. In China, the weakening of imperial structures, the rise of new governments, and the entrance of modern ideologies like socialism and republicanism began to dismantle the Jianming distinction. This led toward the eventual legal abolition of inherited low-status groups. Meanwhile, on the Indian subcontinent, stronger reformers, educated movements, freedom struggles, and newly awakened national identities converged to challenge untouchability at its very roots. They created a wave of collective courage unlike anything seen before. Within this charged atmosphere, the world inched closer and closer to the moment where the old walls would finally begin to crumble. As the world entered a new era of self-awareness, the long-standing structures of untouchability and inherited social inferiority did not collapse suddenly. They were dismantled piece by piece by the determined work of reformers, thinkers, lawmakers, activists, and ordinary people who united toward a vision of dignity for all. In China, the early 20th century witnessed enormous political shifts. Dynastic rule ended, republican ideals emerged, and new governments viewed inherited social subcategories like the Jianmin as outdated remnants of a rigid past. This led to their formal abolition, supported by social philosophies that promoted equality and collective uplift. Meanwhile, on the Indian subcontinent, the movement took a more layered and complex path. Figures like B.R. Ambedkar, Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule, and numerous regional leaders challenged the very foundation of ritual purity and caste discrimination. They did so through education, political activism, powerful public speeches, literary works, and relentless advocacy. Their work ultimately influenced the formation of legal protections and constitutional safeguards after independence. This included the explicit abolition of untouchability and the creation of affirmative policies designed to uplift historically excluded communities. This legal transformation was matched by spiritual and cultural movements that preached equality, unity, and the recognition of divine worth in all human beings. Together, these forces, political, social, spiritual, and academic, formed a powerful intertwined current. It was strong enough to sweep away the structures that had stood for thousands of years. This proved that real change does not come from a single hero or a sudden miracle. It comes from the collective persistence of countless individuals who refuse to accept injustice as destiny. The end of untouchability and parallel exclusion systems did not mean that centuries of prejudice vanished overnight, but it signaled the beginning of a new world where the law, society, and culture gradually aligned themselves with the idea that every person has inherent worth that cannot be measured by birth, occupation, or ritual belief. Once the discriminatory categories were legally removed, societies began creating new institutions. Educational programs, social empowerment schemes, community building initiatives, cultural reforms, and new national narratives all began to emphasize unity and equality. Although the transition was not easy, the presence of constitutional authority ensured that individuals who had once been marginalized could now enter schools, participate in governance, pursue professions previously denied to them, and help shape the future of nations that had once denied their humanity. In China, the abolition of the Jianmin class opened pathways for families to redefine themselves socially and economically, blending into mainstream society without the stigma of inherited inferiority. In the Indian subcontinent, the fight continued in social and cultural spheres, even after the legal victory. Communities worked tirelessly to rebuild confidence, identity, and opportunity after generations of exclusion. These shifts created a world where the narrative of impurity and inherited worth slowly lost its grip. It was replaced by ideas of equal rights, human dignity, and a collective responsibility to ensure that old injustices do not quietly return under new names. And so the ending of the system, while imperfect, marked one of the most significant moral transformations in human history. In the years following the abolition of untouchability and similar exclusion systems, the people who had once been pushed to the margins began to step into spaces that generations before them could only dream of. They carried with them not just the weight of their ancestors' struggles, but the hope of a future built on dignity rather than division. Children attended schools without fear. Families entered workplaces and public spaces that had previously rejected them. Communities slowly healed the deep wounds left by centuries of separation, discovering that belonging was not something to be granted by others, but something they possessed simply by virtue of being human. Yet even as progress took root, the world learned a profound and difficult lesson. It is far easier to change laws than to change hearts. Although the old system was broken, its shadows lingered in subtle biases, quiet judgments, and inherited mindsets that still required patience, education, and empathy to overcome. Still, the resilience of those once excluded proved stronger than the echoes of discrimination. Each new generation rose with clearer eyes and broader hope, rewriting the identity of communities that had been defined by others for far too long. And so the story ends not with a final conclusion, but with a question that hangs in the air like a whisper from the past. Now that humanity has broken the chains of ancient inequality, will we protect this hard-earned freedom, or will we allow new forms of division to rise in its place? It's a suspenseful moral, reminding us that every society must remain awake. For justice is not a destination, but a continuous choice that must be made again and again. The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe join Criminology, and step deeper into the dark with us.